Hello, everyone, and welcome to the California Department of Education's Literacy Knowledge Building video series. In this video, Margaret Goldberg from the Oakland Unified School District and the co-founder of the Right to Read project will discuss how we can support elementary students with dyslexia. Before we begin, let's go over a brief bit of background on the Literacy Knowledge video series. This is a series of videos on critical topics in literacy birth through grade 12. It was developed by the California Department of Education and literacy experts in the state literacy team, and it is complementary to the work of the Federal Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grants. You can learn more about the CLSD grants by going to the California Department of Education's website and searching for CLSD. The purpose of this video series is to provide guidance and resources on critical topics in literacy, to support the work of the CLSD grants, and to build coherence between California's literacy guidance documents, standards, and frameworks and how they all support literacy. A major objective of the CLSD grant is to bring coherence between California's guiding documents, some of which you see here, like the California Preschool Learning Foundations, the Infant Toddler Learning and Development Foundations, the Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities, the Dyslexia Guidelines, and the California English Learner Roadmap. Other content area standards and frameworks support literacy as well. The videos produced in this series will illustrate the connections between all of these documents and also explain how the documents themselves support literacy development for our students. Videos will be produced over the course of the CLSD grant period. To be informed when new videos are posted, join the CLSD listserv by sending a blank email to join-california-literacy-states-development-program at mlist.cde.ca.gov. And now I will turn it over to Margaret.
Hi, my name is Margaret Goldberg, and I'm so happy to be here with you today. I'm the co-founder of the Right to Read project. We're an organization of teachers and researchers, activists, and parents who are all pursuing equity through high-quality literacy instruction. I'm also a teacher in Oakland Unified School District. I currently teach first grade, and in previous years, I was the early literacy lead for the district. I was a literacy coach, and I was also a reading interventionist. We're going to be talking today about two lesson examples. Both of the lessons are ones that I taught myself to real life first graders just a little while ago. We're going to talk about one lesson, which is an example of an unsystematic reading approach. We're going to reflect on how student learning is impacted when our curricula lacks a clear scope and sequence, and when students don't get cumulative practice during reading time. Then we're going to experience a structured reading lesson, and we'll talk about how that approach with a clear scope and sequence and cumulative practice impacts student learning. We're going to close with a short discussion about what we should be looking for in our curricula to make sure that it's as effective as we want it to be for our students. So when I came to Oakland, in the year 2015, I was working at a small school. There were 290 students. 97% of our students were low income. And our first grade data looked like this. So you can see from the red and the yellow that we had the vast majority of our first graders as being flagged as in need of intervention. We had a small percentage that were on watch and a very small percentage of students who were actually at or above benchmark. So my job as a reading interventionist was a big one. I needed to figure out what to do with the majority of students who are in need of intervention in order to be able to be set on a trajectory towards reading success. So what I first started doing was teaching a program that was adopted by my district, and I'm going to share with you a lesson that comes from that program. It's a first grade reading intervention lesson, and it's from a curricula that is found in many different schools, and it's representative of an approach to teaching reading called guided reading. You'll see a lesson where we're coming in at lesson 27. I had done 26 lessons before this with my students. So this particular lesson, according to the teacher's manual, is focused on having students recognize and use short vowel words, CVC words, and teaching them some high frequency words: have, our, on, and some. Before launching this program, I gave my students reading records in order to determine where we should start with our instruction. And then progress monitoring throughout my work with this program was based in reading records. So what I was doing with my students was listening to them read and jotting down notes as I was observing their reading behaviors. As a result, what I knew about my readers was the percentage of accuracy when reading predictable books. So the readers in this group were reading at level B. And I knew that they were paying attention to the meaning and the structure, like the predictable sentence structure in their text. They were not paying attention to the words on the page. So one of the things I started thinking about as I was teaching this lesson was, how am I going about reaching these learning goals to have students read CVC words and some high frequency words when they weren't actually attending to what this program called the visuals? So as you observe this lesson, I want you to think about, how do or don't the parts of this lesson connect? How would this instruction impact students' confidence and their reading development? What you'll see is that the first step of the lesson was a warm-up, having students reread books, and I was told to prompt them for self-monitoring. So if they made an error, I was told to say, try that again, and think about what would make sense. After a warm-up, we dove into some skills practice. So we were doing some phonics or word work using Elkonin boxes. Then for application, students were given a new story to read. It's a level B book. We introduced the text, read the text, and then discussed and revisited the text. According to the manual, I might have had time to do some letter work and maybe coloring some pictures on the ABC book, or if time allowed, doing some phonological awareness work with CVC words. But in my experience, I never had time for these extension components of the lesson. I really was only able to do the warm up, the skills practice, and the application in the 20 to 30 minutes that was allocated for my use of this program. So we're going to dive in now into a lesson experience, and you're going to find out what it's like for a student to learn with unsystematic instruction. The first step in this lesson, according to my teacher's manual, was to display Elkonin boxes and to say the word get and call students' attention to the sounds in the word and then the letters that represent those sounds. So I would say get. The first sound in get is G, and the letter is G. The next sound in get, G, the letter is E. And the last sound in get is T, and the letter is T. Then I would pull that scaffolding away a bit and ask students to say the word bat. First sound, B. Letter, B. Next sound in bat, B. A. Letter, A. Last sound in bat, letter, T. And continue on with that, going through the sounds and the letters that represent them, with quite a few more examples of CVC words. Then my manual asked me to use Elkonin boxes to teach another spelling pattern. Word is like. Say like. First sound, the letter for L is L. Like, L, I. The letter is I. And the last sound in like, K, the letter is K. Now that doesn't look quite right, so I'm going to add E to the end of the word like to make it look right. Let's try another one. Our word is side. Say side. First sound, letter, side. Next sound, I. Letter, I. And the last sound inside, D. The letter is D. And that doesn't look quite right, so we're going to add an E to the end of the word. After our word work with Elkonin boxes, the next step was to introduce a book. I would introduce the book by reading the title out loud and showing the cover. I'll do that for you in just a moment. Then I would stimulate a conversation by asking students to trigger their background knowledge. Have you ever had have you ever had waffles to eat? What are some things you can put on top of a waffle? and explain this book is about some yummy things you can put on top of waffles. So our waffles. Would have students open to this page and ask them, what does the waffle have on it? And they would look at the picture to say syrup. Then I would point out that the words on this page say, let's have syrup on our waffles. So that heavy scaffolding of telling the students what words are in the book before they have read the book is one of the characteristics of a guided reading lesson with predictable text. We would look at another picture. I would ask them, what does this waffle have on it? They'd use the picture to say butter. Again, a characteristic of guided reading when we're working with predictable books. Then I would have students say the word have. I would ask them, what letter would you expect to see first in have? And students would say H. I then have them locate the word have on the page and put their finger underneath it, swiping it from left to right. Now, please note, they're supposed to identify the word have just by the first letter and sound and the letter H. That partial decoding is also typical of guided reading when we're using predictable text. We'd look at another picture, ask the same question, what does the waffle have on it? Again, cueing off of the picture to say strawberries rather than reading the words that are in the text. Then I'd ask students to say the word some and ask them, what letter would you expect to see first in some? Now, invariably, some students would put their finger under the word strawberries because they would see the S in that word. And I would need to correct them and ask them to look at the word some. Now, if students put their finger under the word strawberries, clearly they're not attending to every letter in that word. They can't read the word strawberries. They can only guess this word based on the picture and the first sound. So by having them draw their attention to the word some, I'm trying to prevent a possible reading error that would happen on this page before students have ever attempted to read the page. I would have students locate the word some, put their finger under it, and read that word. So for reading the book, students would turn back to the beginning. They would flip through each one of the pages that you've already seen. I would explain that they would read about all the things that they would a waffle could have on it, and explain that at the end of the book, they're going to find out what happens to the waffle. So students would take a page in the book and they would say, let's have some, look at the picture, cue off the picture and the first letter to say blueberries on our waffle. Let's have some, using the picture again and that first letter, bananas on our waffle. Now, it's important to note that students are not reading through every letter in these words. They're using pictures, they're using the first letter, and they're using that predictable sentence structure to guess what the words might be. They get to the end of the book. Let's eat some waffles. Now, at the end of this lesson, I might have time for some of the optional word work. I didn't usually, but let's take a look at it in case I did have time for it. I would have students write the word hour using magnetic letters. So they would look at the word hour that I had written on a whiteboard, tell me they noticed the O-U-R. I'd give them those letters and they would organize them to make the word hour several times. Then if there was time, they would look at their ABC book, find the remaining picture. The word for X, I think, was xylophone, if I remember quite right. And I would have them color that picture. Again, it was disconnected from the book that they were reading. If time allowed, then I would say a CVC word in parts and have the children blend those parts together to say the word. So let's think about this lesson. How did or didn't the lesson parts connect? We had the rereading of a previously taught book in which students are taught to, if they make an error, think about what would make sense. So not decoding the words, but guessing what the words might be based on sentence structure. Then they did some skills practice using Alconen boxes. We did some CVC words, but then also threw in some long I words like and side. Then they were given a story to read. The introduction to the text was heavily scaffolded telling them what words to expect in the text before they actually read it. Then students were let to read the text, and we would have some time to discuss the text over at the end. And then if we had time, we would do the optional letter or word work.
The story on the slide reads, "Our waffles. Let's have syrup on our waffles. Let's have butter on our waffles. Let's have some strawberries on our waffles. Let's have some blueberries on our waffles. Let's have some bananas on our waffles. Let's eat some waffles."
So let's look at the text students were reading, Our Waffles. Remember that the learning target was to have students recognize and use CVC patterns. So let's look at the book with this lens. How many examples of CVC words do kids have in this text? Pause the video and count the CVC words. If you got 0, that's what I got. They had no opportunities to apply the phonics that I had taught to the book that they were reading. In fact, it had been 8 lessons since the last time CVC words were a focus. I had also taught them this new phonics pattern in the words like and side. I explained to them that they should put an E at the end of a word to make it look right. Let's look to see how many final E words they had with the long vowel sound I. Go ahead and pause and count. Yeah, I got 0 examples. So students had no examples in text of the phonics that they had been introduced in the work at the start of the lesson. In fact, they wouldn't get another opportunity to work with putting an E at the end of a word for another 14 lessons. So this got me thinking quite a bit about what experience students were getting with the book Our Waffles. They weren't getting the opportunity to apply phonics. Another learning goal was to recognize high frequency words, have, our, on, and some. Have and our were new words. On and some, we had been introduced before to. On was 4 lessons ago, some was 19 lessons ago. Take a moment and check the book to see how many opportunities students had to read these high frequency words in connected text. Pause the video. Yeah, so for have, I got 5 examples. Our, they had 5 examples in this text. And then we also did some work with magnetic letters if there was time with the word our. On, they had 5 examples, and some, they had 4 examples. Now, in the next book and in the next lesson, students would have the high frequency words hi, I, have, a, and new. There's not a whole lot of overlap between each lesson. So what I mean by that is when we're thinking about the leaps students were expected to make, going from the phonics instruction to then reading a book where the phonics instruction didn't apply is an example of a cognitive leap. Students were expected to remember phonics, but not actually use it when trying to read their predictable text. Now, I gave them a text where they couldn't actually read the words that were in that book. So they were expected to compensate by using the pictures and the predictable sentence structure. So I want you to take a moment and reflect. How would this instruction impact students' reading development and their confidence? Pause the video to think through these questions. Okay, so what you see here is what happened when I started thinking through what are students actually experiencing over the course of a series of lessons. So if you look across the top, you'll be able to see the lesson numbers 1 through 26. And if you look down, you'll see the high frequency words that were identified as a focus in those lessons and that appeared in the book students were reading. And all of this white space, what you see is the number of days that went by before students had another opportunity to see and practice with that word again. This white space, it's all opportunities for students to forget what they had learned in prior instruction. So this connects to our research because in the article, Whole Language Hijinks, How to Tell When Scientifically Based Reading Instruction Isn't, by Dr. Louisa Moats, she explains what happens when students are receiving instruction with leveled books. It can't be systematic instruction. Here's the quote. Leveled books cannot be the basis for a systematic, explicit approach to beginning reading instruction. With each advancing level, students encounter many untaught phonic patterns and words. Lacking the tools to decode the books, students become ever more reliant on memorization and guesswork, unless they are lucky enough to intuit the print code from exposure or incidental teaching. So when we look at this quote and we think about the untaught phonics patterns that students come across in leveled books, we're thinking about words like strawberries and blueberries. We're thinking about how students lack the tools to decode those words. And so as a result, they guess the words based on the predictable sentence structure that I pre-taught, or based on our picture walk where we were looking at the pictures and they were using just the picture and the first letter to guess what a word might be. Now I'm going to walk you through another lesson example. This lesson is also a first grade reading intervention lesson. It's one that I taught to my students. It comes from a curriculum that's popular, but what's different about this instruction is that it is systematic, it's sequential, students receive explicit instruction, and it includes cumulative practice. Prior to this lesson, students received 60 lessons, so they had already mastered their short vowels at the time that I did this instruction with them. I picked this lesson because it focuses on final E. It's an introduction to the concept of long vowels. I think this lesson is a really great contrast to the lesson you saw before. In the lesson you saw before, students were told that words like side and like have an E at the end of them to make them look right. The focus in lesson 1 that you saw was on reading as a visual process. Students were expected to memorize words based on the way they looked. This lesson is different. This is asking students to attend to the sounds that they hear in words and to understand how those letters represent sounds. They're going to learn some high frequency words, large, every, and after, that don't follow the phonics patterns they've previously been taught.
The slide reads, Joseph, 7 out of 10 decodable words and 6 out of 10 sight words. Victor, 10 out of 10 decodable words and 10 out of 10 sight words. Omar, 9 out of 10 decodable words and 9 out of 10 sight words. Katie, 9 out of 10 decodable words and 10 out of 10 sight words. And Genesis, 9 out of 10 decodable words and 9 out of 10 sight words.
So this program included some assessment. And the assessment asked me to have students read some words by sounding them out and also recall some high frequency sight words. So the data that I collected on my students was very discrete. What I found out was with these discrete skills, how many students had mastered them and how many students needed me to go back and reteach the concept so that they had a solid foundation with no gaps in knowledge before getting onto a new phonics concept. As you observe this lesson, I want you to consider, how is this different from the previous lesson? And also, how would this instruction impact students' reading development and their confidence? I'm going to ask you to play along a little bit as we do this lesson kind of in speed view. So in the lesson, you're going to have some phonological segmentation. There's going to be attention to the final sound in words, so it's a more advanced phonemic skill. Then we'll do some phonics work. First, we'll go over whether letters are vowels or consonants. It's important that students know what a vowel is because we're going to introduce the concept of long vowels with final E. Students will review the letter sounds they've already been taught, and they'll read a decodable word list. Then they'll practice some sight words with 3 new words and 10 to 15 cumulative practice words. Then students will dive into the application portion of the lesson. So we'll do dictation with 4 decodable words. They'll sound out the words and then write them. And then 2 sight words, words that don't fit the phonics patterns they've previously been taught. And 1 sentence that combines decodable words and sight words. Then students will read a story. They get a new decodable story in this lesson, and they'll also review the stories that they've already practiced. So here we go into a lesson experience. I'm going to ask you to play along with me. Say gain. Sound gain. So what I hope to hear is g, aim. Last sound. Mm. Say bone. Sound bone. Last sound. And students would continue like this, saying hope, hope, last sound p, and pile, p, I'll, last sound l, and cube, k, cube, last sound b. Next step in the lesson is to say if a letter is a vowel or consonant. Consonant, consonant, vowel, vowel, consonant, vowel. Then to review prior learning, we would tell students that the vowels we've been practicing earlier, a, e, a, and these were all short vowels. Vowels can also be called long vowels, and that's when the vowel says its name. As in A, making the A sound in words like cake and make, or E having the E sound in a word like tree. I in kite, own in bone, U in mule, or oo as in hoot. And so what I want my students to know is that these spelling sound cards represent long vowels. And the spelling pattern that we're focusing on is when E comes at the end of a word after a consonant, the vowel may make its long sound. A, this is long A, E, the spelling for long E, I, etc. Then I had students practice these sounds in isolation.
The slide will read A_E, E_E, I_E, O_E, and U_E.
So I would want them to see this spelling pattern and know to say A. We would practice that and review all of the other spelling patterns. They would do I and O. They would also learn to pronounce U and oo, the two sounds for long U. Then I take these newly taught sounds and mix them in with sounds that they had previously reviewed. So I would have my students say shh.
The slide will read SH_TCH, I_E, O_TH, I_DGE, A_E, A_U_E_E_E, O_E, and ED.
And sh. And keep reviewing I and each one of the spelling sounds they had already been taught. This cumulative practice is really important because there are several sounds that are really tricky for students, like the voiced and unvoiced sounds for TH, or the multiple sounds that ED can make at the end of the word, t, d, and id. So this cumulative practice is what made them so successful when they would take those progress monitoring assessments, reading words in isolation, those decodable words. I'd also want to make sure that they understand this concept of final E. So we would take a look at a word like mad, which they're already able to read, and contrast it with a word like made, calling students' attention to the E that's at the end of the word that causes the A to have the long A sound. I'd have them read pet and contrast that with a word that has an E at the end, causing this E to have a long vowel sound, Pete. I would have students read lick and then like. And if there's ever an error that they make, what I'm doing to correct them is calling their attention to whether or not there's an E at the end, if the vowel will be long or short, and then I'd have them read the word correctly. This is very different than the corrective feedback that was in lesson example 1, where the corrective feedback was, does that sound right? Or does that make sense? This is actually drawing students' attention to the phonics that they're seeing in these words. Then they get some mixed review. So I'd have them read words like quit and black and try a word that had final E in it. These, if they made an error, then I would correct them with, is there an E at the end? Long or short? Sound for long E, read the word. We'd go through some practice with words with and without final E. After this, then we get into some sight words, words that don't match the phonics patterns they've been taught. So in the sentence, he drives a large truck, our sight word is here, large. Every bird flew away, we would practice every, and in come to my house after school, we'd call their attention to the word after. Now, with these words that we're teaching as sight words, we want students to attend to every letter in these words. So we want them to read the word large and spell it L-A-R-G-E, large, so that they're attending to every letter in every one of these words, even though the phonics are not those that they're able to sound out. After they've read and spelled each one of these new words, we put it in the review deck, and here we go. They would review each one of the sight words in our cumulative practice. Read, spell, reading each word. So talk, T-A-L-K, talk. Other, O-T-H-E-R, other. The next step in the lesson is actually my favorite and my students' favorite. The next step is where they're applying this phonics to encoding. So I always, like in distance learning, for example, I'll actually have them hold up their materials so that they can show me that they have something to write with and something that they can write on. With this, they are going to be hearing a word, attending to the sounds in the word, and then they're going to be writing it on their whiteboards. So play along with me. Our first word is note. I wrote a note to my teacher. Say note. Sound note. I want to listen to make sure my students would say note. Then they would write the sounds that they hear in note. So they would write n, o, which they have learned to spell as O blank E. And the last sound in note is t. I want to make sure that they know to put the t on the line to have the word note. We'd continue on like this. So they would get more decodable words, including long vowels, which we've been practicing, but also some short vowels mixed in so that we're sure that they've mastered the concept and they're not just sticking an E at the end of every word. So student practice would include in this lesson note, ride, mute, and tap. Then they also get two sight words, which they read and spell. So of, O-F, and put, P-U-T. And then a sentence. So I would tell students our sentence is we can wait. Say the sentence. First word, sight word or sound out word, and they would write the sight word we. We would move on to can, which they can sound out, and wade, which they can sound out. Then I would check their sentence to make sure it's got proper punctuation and a period, and check to make sure that they've spelled each one of their words correctly. After applying their phonics to encoding, now they're going to focus on decoding in the context of a story. So my first step is to introduce the story and stimulate the background knowledge necessary to comprehend the story. So this is a story that they're going to read about penguins. And if possible, I would even connect it to their background knowledge with a map, for example, with a picture of Antarctica, and explain that penguins live there. Notice I'm not pre-teaching the words in the story. Students are able to already read the words in the story because they've been taught all of the phonics necessary to sound out and read the words in the story penguins. So let's analyze this lesson that you just saw and store in the back of our mind, how is this lesson different from the previous example?
The story on the slide reads, Penguins. Penguins are birds. They have wings, but they cannot fly. They use their wings to swim. They dive in the water to chase and catch fish. Penguins walk. They can slide, too. They can walk up a large hill and slide down the other side. Penguins do not make a nest. The mother will lay one large egg. She will put it on the father's feet. She goes to get food after that. The egg will be safe on the father's feet. Every male penguin can take care of an egg. He will take care of it for a long time. He stands close to the other fathers so the egg is not cold. The chick hatches while the mother goes out to get food. It is small and cute. The chick is safe on the father's feet. It is under a thick flap of skin. The mother came back. She went more than a mile to the water. She ate many fish. The father has not had any food for a long time. He will make the same long trip to the water after she is home, then he will go back to his mate with food for the chick. Penguins do this every time they have a chick.
Let's start with the text. So here's the story that students read. And the phonics principle was final E. I want you to pause the video and really count how many final E words are there in this text. Go ahead and pause it and count. Did you get 27? That's what I got. So this is really interesting. They got 27 examples of final E words in connected text, and final E is going to appear in every one of the subsequent lessons. The concept is going to be assessed after 4 lessons so that I have the information to know whether or not students are looking to the end of the word to see if there's an E there, and whether or not they're making the appropriate vowel sound based on there is or isn't an E. If they did not pass their mastery tests, then I would go back and reteach these lessons to ensure they have a solid foundation before adding in new concepts. Now, another thing students were practicing were high frequency words: large, every, and after. I won't make you count them. I'll just tell you that there's 2 examples of each one of these high frequency words. Plus, they got many practices reading and spelling the words before they ever got into this connected text. Now, in this story, there are high frequency words that were previously taught, like there and father, but look at this. We have some non-examples of final E: have, are, and more. These are words that end in E that do not have a long vowel sound. And what's important for us to know is that they've had these words for 18 lessons. They've had daily review with these words. I've assessed them on these words, and I'm sure that these non-examples won't confuse them as they're reading this passage because they've mastered them. So let's take a moment and think about how this experience is different than what you saw earlier and how it impacts students' reading development, and also their confidence. Let's think for a moment about those high frequency words, for example. When I instructed students in the high frequency words, large, every, and after, I could trust that they were going to learn those words to the point of mastery. Because take a look at this. Once the word is introduced, there's cumulative practice. That word appears in our review deck and in our stories until students have mastered the word and it no longer needs to be practiced. This is a really different learning experience than what you saw in guided reading, where the texts are not controlled for the sight words and for the phonics that students have been taught. And as a result, there's a lot of space in between lessons where students can easily forget a concept that they've been taught. They could find themselves in the position of needing to guess words, and they're more likely to rely on things like sentence structure, things like pictures, because they can't recognize the words that they saw so many lessons ago. So I actually did a little bit of a study on my students. I compared the incidental instruction in guided reading with the systematic instruction and the other lesson style. And what I found is that while guided reading heavily emphasizes learning words by sight, it focuses on reading as if it were a visual process, my students were not retaining the sight words that they were encountering in their guided reading texts. Versus the other approach with systematic instruction, where they will attend to every letter in the words, reading and spelling the words, and they were retaining those words at a much higher rate. There's a quote from Dr. Ann Castles that I love. She was asked, "Is sight word teaching effective?" And she answered, "The short answer is yes. Numerous experimental studies have reported substantial and sustained improvements in children's word reading following targeted teaching of those words in both typical and struggling readers." The longer answer is that, of course, effectiveness varies according to the nature of the teaching. And more research comparing the efficacy of different methods is sorely needed. So I can say from my own experience that having students encounter words in text is not enough to help them memorize those words, especially if they can use compensatory strategies like sentence structure or pictures to avoid having to attend to the letters and words. But when we come to this study of the nature of the teaching, whether students are taught to read and spell a word like large, or if they're taught to sound out the word large and note the spelling pattern that is surprising, that E at the end of the word, and then maybe they're taught the rule for why there is an E at the end of a word that ends in G, making the J sound. There is actually a real need for more research on which methods are more effective for students and why. There is some guidance in the Resource Guide to Foundational Skills that CDE has released. There's this quote: "If children have been taught the most common sounds for the letters P and A, they may be confused by Phil's name card or an alphabet book that states A is for art. These inconsistencies should be noted when they are encountered." Initially, beginning readers' exposure to print that matches instruction should be maximized. Otherwise, the instruction seems irrelevant and is confusing to learners. And when I read this quote, I had kind of an aha because I realized in my guided reading instruction, they were not getting print that matched the word work that we were doing. And as a result, our word work seemed irrelevant to the process of reading. My students were starting to develop the habit of relying on my book introductions, on picture walks, on being told the predictable structure of the sentences in those books, rather than attending to the words that were written on the page and applying phonics. Here's another quote: "The amount of time devoted to decodable text depends upon how quickly beginning readers grasp the code. Some children need considerable practice with decodable books. Others need less because they more quickly acquire and apply the skills." So with an example of final E, for some students, they can quickly internalize, oh, there's an E at the end of the word, it's going to have the long vowel sound. For other students, it is a long, laborious process of checking to see if there's an E, just even remembering to check to see if there's an E at the end of the word, remembering if the vowel sound should be long or short, and then sounding out the word. So how much time it takes a child to internalize a phonics pattern is what should be used to determine how long they need decodable text. Once students are able to read long vowel words, they probably don't need words to be controlled in quite the same way. That means that they can move on to uncontrolled text, also known as real books. Learners should be provided instruction in texts that reflect and advance their skills. So here is the data, the beginning of the year data I showed you.
In fall of first grade, at or above benchmark was 8%, on watch was 5%, intervention was 28%, and urgent intervention was 59%.
From first graders. And you could see that I had just 8% of students at my school in first grade who were reading according to benchmark. When they received systematic, explicit instruction that include a code-focused approach, when they got that instruction, and they didn't even get it all school year long because I was still making that shift from guided reading to systematic instruction. When they did get the instruction, take a look at what happened. This was fall first grade, just 8% of students at benchmark, so many in need of intervention. And then look what happened. Yeah.
In spring of first grade, at or above benchmark was 63%, on watch was 16%, intervention was 7%, and urgent intervention was 14%.
In spring, 63% of students were able to read at benchmark. On watch, we had 16%, and our need for intervention was cut down to a manageable amount. So when we think about systematic, explicit instruction that is code-focused, it's a helps all, harms none approach, with helping much more of our students get to the point of benchmark And it's also the first tier of instruction for students who are going to need a second tier or third tier in intervention. So let's compare these two approaches. You saw two lessons. In lesson 1, it was guided reading. It included phonics instruction. There was some attention to phonemic awareness. Those Elkonin boxes were there. We were listening to sounds and words. But still, guided reading is based on the belief that reading is a visual process. So the application of the phonemic awareness in phonics is not there. It misunderstands the role of context in skilled reading, believing that students can use context to identify words. That means that students are really heavily dependent on a book introduction. It means that they're supposed to know the meaning of a book before they actually read the book. It gets reading comprehension backwards, as if comprehension comes first and the words come after. Readers compensate in guided reading for a lack of systematic phonics by guessing words. And they guess words based on the predictable sentence structure, the pictures, and the pre-teaching that happens in the beginning of the lesson. So students become desperate. They start memorizing texts. They start focusing on teacher prompting. They start struggling if the code doesn't come naturally or easily to them. We compare this to a structured phonics lesson in which there's explicit phonemic awareness and phonics instruction that's taught for the purpose of reading. We are teaching children to sound out words. We follow a scope and sequence, so no phonics patterns are left out. And students get a chance to apply what they're learning to connected text and also to their writing. Readers in this approach know to approach unfamiliar words by sounding them out. And this is a strategy that's going to work for them throughout the grades. So in guided reading, where words could be determined based on the picture or the sentence structure, that's not possible when kids get into the higher level text when they're in grades 4 and 5, even 2 and 3. They need to actually attend to the words, and they need to have a strategy for what to do when they come to an unfamiliar word. The most reliable strategy is to sound the word out. A structured phonics lesson promotes orthographic mapping. What that means is that students are connecting the letters to the sounds they represent, to the spoken word, and to the meaning of that word, and then applying it to the context in which they're reading. So our readers become efficient and independent and confident. They know what to do when they get to an unfamiliar word. So let's pause for a moment and think about some quick tips, what we should look for in curricula. This is really important because, as you saw from this example and probably also from your own experience, there's a lot of curricula out there that is not likely to help all of our students get to reading success. There's a lot of curricula out there that's based on the misguided approach to teaching reading. It's based on this 3Qing approach, which acts as if students can use meaning and syntax or structure and visuals to identify words, rather than going through the process of sounding words out, attending to every letter and every word, and as a result, being able to pronounce the word and match it onto a word that they have understood from our oral language. We want to look in our curricula to make sure that there is an evidence-based explanation for how skilled reading develops. We want to stay away from anything that is mentioning MSV. We need to make sure that there is a clear scope and sequence for instruction that includes phonological awareness, so building from larger chunks, maybe syllabication, to smaller chunks, phonemic awareness, to swapping out sounds and manipulation. It's really important that our students are able to play with the sounds and words. There should also be a clear scope and sequence for phonics. We want to make sure that they're working on simpler concepts and building up towards more complex ones, all of which are being taught for the purpose of reading. We want to make sure our curricula includes progress monitoring so that foundational skills are taught to mastery, and so that students get ongoing review and cumulative practice so they have a solid foundation in reading. I really appreciate you taking your time to go through these lesson examples and think them through. Also reflect on your own practice. You're welcome to reach out to me. I'm available via email at margaret@right2readproject.com or on social media, or you can check out some of the blogs that I've written on the learning that I've done. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for viewing Supporting Elementary Students with Dyslexia. Access the discussion questions to deepen your learning with your colleagues. And make sure to watch the next video in the series, World Builder Intervention, a tool to support decoding multisyllabic words. Thanks.